Oh, that's very nice. How are you? How are you, Slater? There's a little segment we call Life Lesson. I want to talk about your conscience. Your conscience. How sensitive is your conscience? How closely can you hear it? And do you follow it when you do? We talked on the show a lot that there's 4 limits to bad behavior. God, conscience, culture, which is your family and people around you, and the law, police and courts. So 4 limits on bad behavior: God, conscience, culture, and the law. And we live in a culture that, well, a couple things. First of all, progressives have systematically removed each of these from our society. They've removed God, they've removed our conscience, they've destroyed our culture, and now defund the police, right? And then we wonder why bad things happen. But I want to focus on conscience in this segment. We live in a culture that tells you to never listen to your conscience, to turn it off. We live in a culture that tells people that their conscience is a social construct. And that is a lie. We need to understand what the conscience is. So again, our modern culture says feelings of guilt are bad or are hurtful. Therefore, turn them off. Turn off the feelings. Don't get to the root of why you have those feelings of guilt, because nothing you do is ever wrong. Everything you do is great and perfect and wonderful all the time. So if you feel guilt for that, that's your conscience speaking, but it's your conscience that's wrong. So you just better turn that thing off. Cut it off right now, because that's making you feel bad. We're told that your conscience is a defect. It's a defect inside of you that robs you of your self-esteem. And that's all wrong. I'm stealing this from John MacArthur. He says, your ability to sense your own guilt is a gift from God. So we need to, it's not that we need to do a better job of ignoring your conscience. No, the opposite. We need to do a way better job of paying attention to it, of hearing it in the first place, and then actually following on it. MacArthur says the conscience has an innate ability to sense right and wrong. When you violate your conscience, it condemns you, triggers feelings of shame, anguish, regret, consternation, anxiety, disgrace, even fear. These are good things. It's telling you not to do this thing that you're going to do. And the question is, how much of what we see today, how much of the movements that we see today, the social justice movement and all that, is rooted in shame, guilt, regret, anxiety, right? People feel shame for what they do, and then they try and bury it. So they double down on that thing that made them feel shame. So they become an activist to try to make it a good thing that I'm doing this thing that is causing me shame. And you do that long enough, and you have successfully cut yourself off from your conscience entirely. So the word conscience is super interesting. So it's a combination of 2 Latin words. The first is scire, S-C-I-R-E, S-C-I-R-E. It means to know. This is where we get the word science. And it has a double meaning. It also means to cut, meaning to differentiate one thing from another. And this is where we get the word scissors. And then con in Latin means together. So conscience literally means knowledge together with oneself. Knowledge together with oneself. So that means your conscience knows your inner motives and your true thoughts way deeper than your brain. Your conscience is above reason, it's above intellect. You can rationalize and justify yourself and your actions in your own mind, right? And there's a lot of research that actually the higher IQ you are, the better you are at lying to yourself and rationalizing bad behavior to yourself. So you're good at that, but it is hard to rationalize and outwit your conscience. You can't, so instead you just cut it out. But that's really hard to do. The Hebrew word for conscience is leb, which is usually translated heart. So the Hebrews did not draw any distinction between your conscience and the entire rest of your inner soul. Right? So in the Bible, when Pharaoh hardened his heart, it was his conscience that was cut off from himself. There's so many scriptures that talk about a tender heart. Right? So that just means you're being sensitive to your conscience. You hear it when it's whispering to you. Psalms talk about being upright in heart. All right, so upright, that means someone with a pure conscience. David prayed, create in me a clean heart. So he wanted a cleansed conscience. But if you keep violating it over and over, and especially when we live in a society that encourages you to violate your conscience, eventually it goes silent. Or it may be screaming to you at the top of its lungs, but you just don't hear it anymore. Now, this is an important point that John MacArthur says. He says that a conscience can be either dulled or sharpened. It can be dulled or sharpened over time. So in order to sharpen it, you just need to refine it with God's word and better align it with God's truth. And he says that the conscience, it's a skylight. It's not a light bulb. It's not a light bulb inside of you that has its own source necessarily. It's a skylight. And the effectiveness of a conscience is determined by the amount of pure light that you expose it to and how clean you keep it. Cover it up or put it in total darkness, and it ceases to function. I'll give you another metaphor. A conscience is like the nerve endings in your fingertips. Its sensitivity to whatever it's touching can be damaged by a buildup of calluses, or even wounded so badly you don't feel anything. And that's why Paul wrote about a calloused conscience. He literally, 1 Corinthians, talked about a calloused conscience, a wounded conscience, a seared conscience. And we lie to ourselves, and then it's even worse when you have adults and your school and every cultural force around you is training you to ignore your conscience. We need to be raising kids to deeply understand our conscience, to listen to it, to purify it daily. If we keep doing these, instead we just keep doing these bad things over and over again, and we wonder why. Well, it's because you're not listening to your conscience. So let's try to gear into that again, right? Let's try to tune into that. Let's listen to your conscience again. Maybe it's been wounded for too long. Listen to it and then follow it.
Wow, that was deep and insightful. I want more of that.
Like, subscribe, get more.